Good morning, Leadership Longview. If you're watching this, there's a good chance that I'm probably in Guam right now, and I regret not being there with you. And I hope that we can keep the same energy and passion from the last class going with this class. And I want to first of all thank Chris and Justin for helping make this possible. You know, the facilitators often have the hardest job because they have to coordinate all the speakers and make things work. And I was going to ask Justin to come up and do a quick favor for us. In order to show the energy that it requires to be a great facilitator for Leadership Longview, Justin is going to come up to the front of the room and do some one-arm push-ups for the rest of the group. I'm just kidding. Anyway, it's an honor to be back, and as we go through this portion of our module today, you know, we're going to have some sections where we'll pause, and then I'll let Justin or Chris actually facilitate asking some questions to get you involved and keep you involved. Now, when I pause, I'll let you stop the DVD and then you can go ahead and participate that way. As we get started with this module, you know, for tour day we talked a lot about what's important as a leader. And we came up with some objectives that I think you'll see are pretty clarifying and sometimes challenging for us as the leader. First of all, we want to make sure that during the day we continue to appreciate diversity as a workplace and a community. You know, there's some things about diversity that people sometimes struggle with, how you define it, what it is not, and we're going to hopefully clarify that for you today. And the other thing we're going to do today is talk about the characteristics of good leaders. What makes a good leader? What makes an ineffective leader? And as we go through this, I hope that you explore your own leadership capability. And for most of us, you know, people call me the leadership expert, and I usually clarify that by saying, well, you know what, you know, I may study and I may do a lot of writing, a lot of speaking about leadership, but I'm truly a student of leadership. I think it's a journey, not a destination. So following that idea, we're going to talk about why diversity is so important. Now, think about the workplace, and when you think of diversity, don't think of just the typical stereotypical idea of diversity. Think of how many different types of people, different ages, different backgrounds, all the different things that make a diverse workplace. And think about how that, in today's work setting, makes the workplace more effective. In other words, if there's different ways of thinking, different ideas, different backgrounds, different experiences that people bring to the table, we're going to be more effective. And we also tend to believe that greater diversity increases morale. People are more excited about coming to a workplace where it's not a cookie cutter. Everybody's not exactly the same and everybody doesn't think the same. One of the values that I teach a lot in my leadership training is a concept called unity but not uniformity. It's important for us to be united in our purpose but not uniform in our thinking, if that makes sense. In other words, being candid and being willing to disagree and still support each other is really important for a great organization. We're also going to talk about how diversity helps us serve new community segments. Most of you are really aware of how much the community has changed in the last 10 or even 20 years. People move, people change, demographics change. Even the book that I'm writing right now about the talent exodus talks about how the workplace and the community as a whole is changing. We've got baby boomers that are going to be retiring at an alarming rate here in just about 2 months. So think about how you can better serve the community by being a diverse organization. And last but not least, I want you to think about how diversity enhances productivity. How being able to capture the best of a lot of different groups can help us improve the productivity of any organization, from a for-profit enterprise to the nonprofit that is still trying to serve a critical public need. And then I love this quote, "Diversity is just good business." Now what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video here for a minute, and I want you to talk about why diversity is good business. Spend about 2 or 3 minutes doing that and then start the tape in a moment. All right. Now let me talk about the identity groups. This is where a lot of people get a little bit confused. When they get ready to try to define the word diversity, they look at identity groups. How many people do we have on the payroll with this background? Or how many people do we have on the payroll with this background? And it's so much more than that. Diversity is more about how you think than how you look. It's more about how your background impacts the service or the organization that you're involved in rather than what kind of numbers are on the payroll. So think about that. Don't get stuck in the idea that it's just about your identity group, because that's a pretty limiting scope or a limiting paradigm when it comes to how you view diversity. So here's a definition that I thought you would enjoy. First of all, varied perspectives and approaches to work that members of different identity groups bring to your organization. So let me go through that again. It is varied perspectives. Remember the idea about perspectives. You can have two different perspectives and still be equally right depending on what you're seeing. And the approach to work that you bring can be varied as well. A Generation Y is going to be a lot more tech savvy than many baby boomers because they've grown up with technology their entire lives. For many of us who are a little older, we had to adapt to technology over time. It wasn't part of our life from the time we were real small. You know, I remember a funny story. My oldest son, when he was 2 years old, he was in our office at home and he was working on a computer, and you could see his little head looking up, you could see his hand on the mouse, and he was not more than 2 years old. And I remember standing at the door with my wife looking at him on the computer, and I told her, I said, "Genius. We've got a little genius on our hand." And my quick-witted wife said, "Yeah, they say that skips a generation." So anyway, varied perspectives from different members that have different ideas on how to run your organization. Now, I'm going to ask this question, and I want you guys to discuss this as well for about 2 or 3 minutes. Explain why this is so important in our community. Explain why different perspectives, different approaches, and why different identity groups are critical to our community. Go ahead and pause the video for about 2 or 3 minutes and make that discussion take place. All right, now one thing to be careful of, we have a concept called the access and legitimacy paradigm. Now everybody knows paradigm is a certain way of thinking, but the access and legitimacy paradigm is when you use specific employees to gain access to special markets, and as a result of doing that, some people can be, well, they can feel exploited. In other words, if we hire a Hispanic salesperson solely for the reason that we want them to market in a Hispanic community, they may feel like they weren't hired necessarily just for their ability as a sales professional. They may feel sometimes that they were hired because of their background. So just have that in the back of your mind. People want to feel qualified for the work that they're doing and not just selected because they are in a certain identity group. So, you know, that's just one thing to be a little sensitive to. It's not that it would be something that people would necessarily run away from, but people want to feel appreciated for the accomplishments and the work that they do, not just because they're in a specific identity group on a payroll. Now here's some guidelines to managing diversity. If you do these things, there's 10 of them. If you do, it will give you a lot of benefit within your organization. And I want you to think about these 10 as you go throughout the rest of your day. First of all, clarify the motivation. You know, a diverse workforce is the future and creates a competitive advantage. Don't go into diversity because you feel like you have to. Do it because it's something that you think will give you an advantage or some sort of competitive advantage in the future. If you do that, it won't be something that comes across as mechanical or painful. It will become something that you kind of enjoy. The changes in the workforce make diversity a lot of fun these days. And when you start to build a workplace around, let's just say, the future generation, Generation Y, and the different ways that that generation thinks, it makes it a lot of fun. Number 2, clarify your vision. In other words, attempt to see qualified women and minorities in positions that were held traditionally by only one segment of the population in the past. In other words, what would it look like to have a CEO that looks different from every other CEO that we've had in the past? And then expand your focus. Diversity is not just race. It's gender, it's ethnicity, it's background. Education is also a form of diversity. Function, and then also personality. And then audit your culture. Make sure the entire culture supports diversity. You know, it's really easy to write, you know, the EEOC statement on a policy somewhere and hang it on a wall. It's a lot more difficult to really try to live that piece within your own business. And for me, an example of that was when I started my company. I am much more attuned to face-to-face training. I really love getting in front of a group and doing what I do. And for several years I was told that you really need to develop online training. And I said, well, really, I don't like that. I don't want to do the online training. Well, about 2 years ago, I finally bit the bullet and decided that I would go ahead and spend the money, spend the capital to invest. And if you go to my website now, you can take hundreds of courses with the click of a mouse. Now, the aversion to the online training was in my own head. In other words, I did not want to change the way I thought. And truthfully, this new generation of workers doesn't really have this aversion to online training. They like computer-based training. They like to learn with information at their fingertips, when they want it, how they want it, in bite-sized pieces or in large pieces, and that's what the computer affords them. So I had to change my own thinking. I had to audit my own culture within my own company as well. And then I want you to modify assumptions. Your values can transcend interests. People say decision-making is easy when values are clear. If diversity is a value, then people will make decisions to support that. If it's not, then you're more than likely not going to get the same result that you expect. People say priorities are what runs companies, and that's really not true. Priorities change day to day. A value remains constant. And just writing something on a lithograph and hanging it on a wall is not going to make it a value. Modify your systems. How do you promote? How do you mentor? A lot of companies have a predisposition to think about a young worker as not capable of being able to fulfill a responsible role within the organization. And I wrote an article this week about a 29-year-old chemical engineer that's running an oil field operation. It's going to be one of the chapters in the book. And how many companies today that have been around for a while, especially in the oil business, may not necessarily see a 29-year-old female as the operations manager for a large local operation. So that's one way that you can kind of modify your systems to look for different ways that people can be promoted based on their capability and not just what they look like. Look at your models. What's your expected behavior? Is it hands-on? How are you going to get people involved in getting the support that they need? Do you have people that will help mentor the younger workforce? Or maybe the person that doesn't speak quite as much English? It's certainly a pleasure for me to work with several local companies who are, they're progressive enough to understand the dynamics in our community. It's a sad story, but it's one that we really have to acknowledge. Several years ago, probably 10 years ago, the many workers in the Hispanic community were not necessarily given the same treatment as other workers. I would see people go into workplaces, and they would have large shutdowns, and they would stick the Hispanic worker in the most dangerous situations, in the most difficult situations, without training, without information. And I hate to say it, but I think the reason they did that is a lot of companies they knew they wouldn't complain. They wouldn't be upset, or they wouldn't quit, or they wouldn't challenge the information that was needed for them to do the job safely. So now that I work with local clients who are really thinking beyond that, they're saying, hey, some of them are spending thousands of dollars with my company to help promote and change information so that it is something that is both understandable and something that is there to help the non-English speaking community. So pioneer diversity. Look for people that you think, man, this person would be great as a leader within our organization. And try to break the glass ceiling, so to speak. And it can be not just based on sex or race. It can be based on education. One person that I know, probably one of the best managers that I ever met and had the pleasure of working with, was a gentleman who didn't have a formal education. But he was brilliant. He was a super smart guy. And he was willing to learn whatever he needed to do in order to run an operation with over 500 employees. He didn't let his lack of formal education keep him from learning what he needed to learn. He still developed the capability to run that business. Now let me contrast that. I also worked with a gentleman who had been promoted because he was a very capable, very effective manager to a level where he was really the only one in his peer group that did not have a formal education. And he tried to overcompensate to the point that people didn't listen to him anymore. He was just tuned out, so to speak. So make sure that you help people pioneer and try to be the one that tries to blaze the path for people to move into positions that they may not have been in before. One of the things I love about Southwest Airlines, when Herb Kelleher founded the airlines, he said, we're not going to run this company the same way other people do. We're going to be cut from a different cloth. And it's funny, there's the president of Southwest Airlines today is a lady named Colleen Barrett. Now Colleen Barrett's official title is President and Secretary. She keeps the title Secretary in her official title to remind people where she came from. You see, she started at Southwest as a secretary. Now you think about this. How many airlines, internationally known companies, would give a secretary the chance to someday become president? That type of thinking is what I mean by pioneering. And then let's apply the special consideration test. Do things create an advantage or a disadvantage for one group or the other? In other words, if you look at your senior leadership group, whether you're a profit or a non-profit, do you see an advantage given to one or another? Do we bring predisposition to think this person is capable or this person is incapable of doing the job? And then number 10, move beyond affirmative action to diversity. What that means is don't stop at just trying to make the numbers look right. If you do that, then sometimes people can feel exploited or feel like they're mistreated. And the old saying is sometimes exploiting one to help another doesn't provide any benefit for either. So here's a thought. We must change what we see in the world. We must change what we see in the world. We must change what we see in the world. So think about Gandhi's message here. He's saying we have to visualize a future that may not necessarily be consistent with the past. We have to think about what it's going to look like amidst the change that's coming down the road. And that's one of the things that my book is really writing about. It's about change. It's about what the workplace is going to look like when we have all these baby boomers leave and the Generation Yers take over. So here's what we're going to do. This is one of our activities. I'm going to pause in a moment and I'm going to let you stop the video, and I want you to write down and try to get at least 5. But if you can get 10, that's even better. But spend about 5 minutes writing down the characteristics of bad leaders. What makes a bad leader? And if someone would either write them down or just keep note of them so we can have those. If you got chart paper, use chart paper. If you don't, just have someone be the scribe to write these down. I think Carrie Pickering, where are you at? I think she volunteered to write these down. And if Carrie's not there, Melanie Northcutt, where are you sitting? I don't think she'd mind writing these down either. And you know I was going to pick on you on this video because I know both of you. They're both in my building. So, I couldn't go through this session without giving you a little bit of a hard time. So go ahead and pause the video right now and write down the characteristics of bad leaders. Okay, now that you've done that, I want you to do the opposite. And don't just say, well, if I wrote bad over here, write good over here. What are the characteristics of good leaders? What do you see in a leader that makes them effective for you? I did a little poll online this morning, and one person said passion. Another person said transparency. What is it for you that makes a good leader? Makes you want to follow someone, or makes you believe others want to follow another? What are their characteristics? Go ahead and pause the video and discuss that for about 5 minutes. All right. Now, what I wanted to do is give you a survey. Now, this survey was done amongst a broad cross-section of companies. It wasn't just one company, it was a lot of companies, and they were asked, okay, what are your perceptions? What are the negative perceptions you have of leaders? And I want to share with you what they said. Now, some of this may parallel real closely to what your team just came up with. Look at number 1. As leaders, we don't listen. Now, we talked about this a little bit in our communication class, and we're going to talk about it some more in some of the following sessions. But folks, listening takes effort. You've got to put the body language and you've got to put the effort in to listen to someone. And if you're like me, who's ADD and your mind is going 100 miles an hour, you have to work really hard at listening and not trying to overpower the conversation with your own perspective. So I have to work really hard at that. Number two, we deliver task instructions as a put down. In other words, we talk down to our people when we ask them to do something. Number three, poor timing in giving instructions. I learned something in the Army that I think is unique. Don't let your lack of planning become my emergency. In other words, because you failed to plan, you want me to jump through hoops. And then as leaders, we refuse to share information from shift to shift or group to group. We don't have a way of making information flow from one section of the organization to the other. There's no continuity there, and that frustrates the employees. Or even worse, we generate non-productive competition. I've seen cases in manufacturing where one shift will actually sabotage the other shift in order to gain favor in the manager's eyes. No accountability or consequence for withholding experience. In other words, we let people fail rather than requiring or in placing a system to help people learn from the mistakes or the successes of the past. One of my favorite is we fail to ask the operator's input in solving problems. Now maybe it's my military background, but you know, the benefit of the doubt rests with the front lines. The benefit of the doubt rests with the people on the front lines. The farther you are away from that, the less you know about what's going on. And it's extremely limiting if you don't ask for the people's involvement when you have a major problem. If you want to get them involved, if you want to energize your group, let them be involved. Lack of respect for our ability and knowledge. You know, I had an operator at a large manufacturing plant tell me something that I thought was remarkable. He said, "John, you know what the problem around here is?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "We get new supervisors in here, new managers, and while they're learning from us, they treat us like we're smart, we're capable, we have something to contribute. And somewhere down the road, 2 weeks, 2 months, somebody comes along and flips a switch. And somehow we go from being very, very smart when they first got here to very, very dumb." And he said, "You know what we do when that happens?" I said, "No, what?" He goes, "We do exactly what they tell us to do." He said, "I don't care if we throw it all away. If they're not going to ask our input, if they're not going to include us, then we're going to do exactly what they tell us to do." Public discipline is demeaning. I had a CEO of a hospital that I was working with one time, and I had a room full of O's. I had the CEO, the CFO, the CNO, the CO, room full of O's. And we were doing leadership training, and he made a comment. He said, "John," he said, "don't you sometimes think it's necessary to make an example out of one person so that the other people know you mean business?" And of course, everybody's eyes were on him, and they started looking at me to see how I was going to answer this question. Now I got to tell you, I won't pull my punches with you. If I work with your organization, I'm going to tell you what I think, even sometimes at my own peril. So here's how I answered this question, and I knew I was about to disagree with him in front of his subordinates. I said, "Well, that is absolutely something you can do as the leader." And I said, short term, you may even derive a benefit. However, long term, I never advocate making an example out of one person in order to make a point with another. I said, if you do that, you may gain a short-term benefit, but long term, you lose the trust of the employees on your team. That was the last time I ever worked with that hospital. Leaders, we don't know how to do the job. Folks, we have got to be on a fast course to learn the specifics of the job. It doesn't mean we have to do them or be capable of doing it. We need to know enough to be able to help the people when they need help. Treatment of individuals is not equal. We have our preferences. You have to work very hard to make sure people don't feel like they are preferred or not preferred over another. One company I worked with, the rumor was you had to go to a certain church to get promoted because that's where all the managers went. Leaders don't recognize that we are learning together. Everyone's making mistakes if they're doing something. I love John Maxwell's book, Failing Forward. He said, in failing forward, not only should we accept honest mistakes, we should encourage them. Because if people aren't failing, they're not what? They're not doing anything. People say, well, how do you define the difference between an honest mistake and a dishonest mistake? Now, I'm a simple guy, so I'm going to give you a simple example. If my 7-year-old spills his milk at the dinner table, I really can't say anything because guess who else is going to spill their milk? But if my 7-year-old is throwing his football at the table and spills his milk, then that's no longer an honest mistake. So look at it through the filter of what they were intending to do when the mistake occurred, and that'll help you get clarification. Not appreciative of our effort to keep upping the ante. In other words, good enough is never good enough. I've had leaders tell me that if I tell my people they're doing a good job, they'll quit. Man, folks, to me that is so backwards. We need appreciation. We need to be recognized for the work that we're doing. Failure to recognize and address people who don't carry the load. They want us to get the dead weight off the team. That's our job as the managers, as the leaders, to get the dead weight off the team. And believe it or not, our own equity as a leader goes down if we don't do that. And then inexperienced people tell experienced people what to do. In other words, you have people without experience telling people what to do. And here's kind of my own methodology, and I'll let you be the judge of how you do it. I always prefer asking people to do something. Now, it may get to the point where I tell them to do it, but I always think it's better to ask. And then here's what they wanted. So this should parallel your good characteristics. Treat us with respect the way we want to be treated. You know, respect is funny. The only way you get it is to give it. You can't demand respect. You can demand fear, but you cannot demand respect. Lend a hand, work side by side. You know, Herb with Southwest Airlines was famous because he'd get out there and roll his sleeves up. And here's the president or chairman of the board loading bags with the guys while he's talking to them, finding out what's going on the flight line. Find ways to use others in solving problems. Get other people involved. Be patient when things go wrong. Express support, not criticism, for your organization. You know, some leaders, especially young leaders, have a hard time realizing that if you say anything negative about the company as a whole, it takes away from your own leadership equity. In other words, you're part of the company that you're now bad-mouthing. And the way I equate it, if you bad-mouth your own spouse or your children or your parents in public, people aren't going to trust you. You have to show that you're united as a leadership team for the organization, and they respect that. They want that. Listen and follow up with people. You follow up, you follow up, you follow up. There is no small item too small that you don't follow up. And I was lucky I had a good boss when I first got into the industry that said, John, no matter how minor the detail is, you follow up. Even if you tell them that you're unable to do it or that you're still working on it, follow up. Now these are fun. Hold people accountable and provide consistent discipline. Isn't it funny that your employees want consistent discipline? People say, where does that come from? It's the rules of the game, folks. We're societal beings. We like to live in society. And we know that the only way to do that is through rules. It's the reason we play sports. It's the reason we do a lot of things. We like the rules of the game. If you took 12 kids and you stuck them in a large gym and said, just play. Once they figured out what they were going to play, they would come up with the rules. There's home base. That's out of bounds. Everybody would know. Recognize and apply motivation that fits the individual. Everybody's not going to be motivated by the same things. You know, it's up to the leader to try to figure out what motivates you the most. Some people are achievement oriented. Some people are motivated by things that are very different. You know, you hear people sometimes say that they're motivated by money. I'm not sure I agree with that, but you hear that all the time. But don't assume everyone's motivated the same way you are. Be proactive in problem solving rather than waiting for things to get bad. In other words, don't wait for conflict. Be proactive. We as a leader are supposed to be looking way down the road. The employees are dealing with the here and now. Allow for people to experience and learn. That means mistakes have to be okay. And you know, I worked for a really great boss one time that said, every time I'd make a mistake, he'd say, hey John, what did we learn from that? And I asked him one day, I said, why do you say that? Why do you say, what did we learn from that? And he said, John, I learned from your mistakes just like you do. And that never left me. And anybody that works with me, if it's an honest mistake and I think you were doing it for the right reasons, you know, that's a learning opportunity. That's something that shows us a glitch in the matrix, so to speak. Be positive and open-minded. I don't know where it's written in the old school handbook for supervisors, but I know it was written somewhere. You know, the grumpier, the meaner, the louder, the more scary the person, the better qualified they were for supervisor. And folks, we need leaders that are going to come in and when things are at their worst, say, hey, we've got this. We're okay. We're going to make it through this. We need that positive approach when things are at their worst. We're okay. We can do this. Calm down. And encourage and instigate group meetings and open communication. You know, we aspire to share our opinion, our thoughts. And in an environment where people aren't meeting regularly, where people don't get information, the negative things are what tend to become prevalent. People assume the negative in the absence of communication. So great companies, great organizations are constantly communicating to their employees. And I'm going to tell you, it's even going to be more imperative with this younger generation. They're the information generation. They're going to want tweets. They're going to want this information on a constant basis. And the best organizations are doing that. They're putting in place systems right now, text message systems, email systems. They're using Facebook. I wrote an article recently about how powerful Facebook is going to be in the future, because every employee in the year 2020 is going to have some sort of media like that. If it's not Facebook, it'll be something similar where they can get messages instantly. And it's going to be pretty myopic for a workplace not to use that media to get their message to their employees as well. So, they said the same thing you probably just said. And what's funny is, when two groups want the same thing, it ought to be easy to accomplish. You think about that. They want the same thing you want, which means it's a pretty typical constant. The things that make good leaders and the things that don't make leaders, or things that make leaders struggle, are pretty universal, whether I'm training in the United States, or in Guam, or in Canada, or in Europe. It doesn't change, folks. So we have to make that decision that we're going to do the things on the positive side and avoid the things on the negative side. Now what happens is kind of like the old boiled frog story. You put the frog in the boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you put the frog in, cool or tepid water and slowly turn up the heat, the frog will boil to death in the boiling water. We're like that as human beings. We get acclimated to our environment, and if it's negative, we start to perpetuate and continue the same negative things that have been going on for years. And everybody's heard the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If you keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep getting what you've been getting. And, here's a question for you. How can you improve without changing? Change is a necessary component of improvement. Doing more of the same is not going to get you where you want to go. So here's a definition. Now, I don't dare profess to say this is the definition. This is a definition. And I really love this definition because it's got some really good talking points. First of all, leadership is a privilege. People say, why do you use the word privilege? Well, you can start your own company and you can call yourself whatever you want. CEO, chairman of the board, superintendent, whatever you want. But folks, you don't get to give the title of leader. Who and only who gives the title of leader? And usually there's some people that will say, well, yourself. Well, the true answer is the follower. Think about it right now. Don't say this out loud, especially if they're in the room with you. But you know right now whether or not your boss is a leader for you. In other words, you would follow them. And some of you may say, well, I wouldn't follow mine out the door. Would you follow that person? And I got to feel that really acutely when I was in the military, because we were getting ready to go the first Gulf War, and you started looking around. Well, who do you trust to follow? Who do you want to follow when lives are on the line? Now we also say influence and direct. So why do you use that terminology? Why do you use those words? Well, great leaders influence others. In other words, we influence people to do something they might never have done had they not come in contact with us. We change people. Now, the reason I leave direct in there is sometimes it doesn't hurt to be direct. Sometimes we just want our boss to be direct. Just tell me what you want and I'll do it. So being direct is okay too. But try to influence first. There's a great quote out there by a gentleman named Charlie Tremendous Jones. And he says something that I really, really believe. It's stuck with me ever since I heard it. Now, I don't know if he's credited with coming up with it, but I think he's credited with saying it quite often. He says the difference between where you are today and where you're going to be this time next year are the people that you meet and the books that you read. In other words, the people that you meet and the books that you read are going to change your path on the tree of life. Think about that. All right, I'm going to pause the video and we're going to come back. I'm going to have him change the DVD, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the values of leadership. All right, actually it wasn't the battery, it wasn't the video, it was the battery that I need to change. But I did want to share with you these values of leadership. In other words, what makes leadership effective? And I think these are 5 core values that you can implement regardless of what you currently have as an organization. Now, let me turn this over. Now, it doesn't matter what values your organization has. These values can augment anything. Think about what your organization would be like if you lived by these values. First of all, if you practiced unfiltered honesty. If you communicated truthfully and factually the whole story without concern or recrimination. You know, think about an environment where you can say what you want without being judged by what you say. In other words, you can share your opinion freely. And that's something that's not easy to accomplish. People have to be comfortable sharing their thoughts. But it's powerful when you use it in a context that gives people the autonomy and freedom to speak up when they disagree. And then the second one, no-fault solutions. Discuss problems in a non-threatening way and understand that mistakes are okay and a solution failure is a company failure. It's an organizational failure. The simplistic view of that is it's not about the who, it's about the what. In other words, there's a lot of time for looking at the who later, but right now let's focus on what caused the problem to happen. And if it happened with one person, it's pretty typical it could happen with another as well. And then the one I mentioned to you earlier, unity but not uniformity. Maintain concentration on the common goal by getting input, being innovative with solutions, and disagree while supporting one another. You know, the most effective leadership teams can get into a room and cuss and discuss and push back and share opinions with extreme candidness, but when they walk out the door, they're united in their purpose. It's the same way as parents with our children. You know, we have to make sure that we create as much alignment as a mom and as a dad as we can so that the kids don't exploit the difference. And you know how smart kids are. And if yours are like mine, they certainly know how to drive a wedge in between two varied opinions as a parent. And then enhance the quality of life. Enjoy our successes with a positive attitude and, there's the F word, have fun at work. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think some companies have had the fun surgically removed. I could not imagine, I just couldn't imagine spending 20 or 30 years in an organization working for a company if I didn't enjoy it. And I hear the opposite of that. I had one young man in one of my classes say something that just, I was flabbergasted. He said he used to have a job that he hated so much that he would get physically ill on Sunday night thinking about going to work on Monday. And I told that in a class, and then one young man stopped it. He said, I got one worse than that. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I used to have a job that I hated so much that every morning when I got to work, I'd go in the bathroom and throw up. I want you to think about the toll that stress would take on your body after 20 or 30 years. I just couldn't imagine it. And it's really going to be irrelevant because the workplace of the future, you're going to be lucky to get 18 months out of an employee 5-10 years down the road. If you don't make it fun, why do it? You know, life is way too short. And I'm not saying it has to be a party every day, but my goodness, we don't have to take ourselves so serious in order to take the topic seriously. And you'll certainly attract more if people feel like their life has been made better because they're part of the team. And then professional etiquette. You seek to increase the worth of each individual. So what does that mean? Well, here's what I believe. There are only really two types of people out there. There's those that give energy. In other words, they're like little battery charging stations where you can go in and you go to their office and you just get a little charge just by having come in contact with them. They give energy. They expel energy to those around them. That's one type of person. And by the way, I don't think you can kind of be in the middle. I think you're either one way or the other most of the time. Now, the opposite of those people are what we call the vampires because they suck the living life right out of you. And all of you know those type people. They're the ones that when you get to work, you pretend like you don't see them. You go, oh my gosh, don't see me, don't see me. Oh my gosh, you saw me. You try to avoid them because you don't want to feel that negativity. So imagine where you are. Do you give energy? I used to work with a guy named Joe, and Joe gave energy just by the way he shook hands. I mean, he'd bite his lip and give a big smile and a big hard handshake. You couldn't help but being energized by his presence. And I think great leaders try to give energy. Even in situations where you don't feel like it, you don't want to, you always try to leave someone a little bit more energized having come in contact with you. All right, so here's the conclusion. As community leaders, as those of you who are leaders within your own organizations, as well as in the community that you serve, and by the way, I think it's really remarkable that most of your companies that I'm familiar with are big on community service. It's probably the reason you're in the room anyway. But as community leaders, how can you promote diversity as individuals as well as leaders? Think about how you can be the one within your organization or within your professional groups or within any segment that you serve that tries to say, you know what, we can be better. And it may be a small fine-tuning with some organizations. You may already be doing this real well. You know, it's kind of like being on the radio dial. Sometimes you just have to fine-tune that station in. And for others of you, may be totally on the wrong frequency. So just kind of figure out where you are and try to be the one that helps bring that clarification into view. And then what happens to communities that don't truly embrace diversity? You know, you end up with a lot of conflict. You end up, in some cases, losing the battle anyway. You know, you are not going to prevent Generation Y from taking over your company or every other company. They are the future. And if you don't embrace that, you know, your organization is very limited in its ability to be, or will be very limited in its ability to be successful down the road. And think about the most precious thing a leader has. It's the thing that most leaders take for granted. And that's the trust of the people that we work with. You know, when you get ready to define leadership for yourself or for anyone else in the organization, it's important that you determine what your trust factor is. Do the people that you serve trust you? And I'm not saying like you. I got to be a supervisor for the first time when I was 24 years old. I had 15 men, mostly older, reporting to me, and I failed, folks. I failed miserably my first time out of the gates. And the main reason I failed was I thought that if they liked me, they'd do what I said. What I found out was, and what some leaders still struggle with, is the fact that leadership is not necessarily about being liked. You know, you think back to the bosses, the coaches, the teachers that meant the most in your life. They weren't always the nicest to you, were they? You know, I think back to my football coach who made a pretty decent football player out of me, even though I was missing 3 key ingredients: no size, no speed, or no talent. But he made a good ball player out of me. I got some recognition as a player because he believed in me. He was hard on me, but he believed in me. And I see some of the characteristics like that in one of my son's coaches now. We look back with, you know, a positive image for the people that sometimes we trusted to be candid, to push us. You know, the teacher said, go back and do it again, you can do better than that. All those things helped us be better as leaders. So, as we conclude for today, you know, I want you to think about where you are in your journey. And don't think of it as a destination, whether you're a leader or not. That's not what I'm talking about. Every one of us are in a journey. Some of us are here, and some of us are here, and some of us are here. But I want you to use the tools that we talked about today, not just to promote leadership in your workplace, but also to be leaders in the community. To be the one that others say, hey, you know, get her to come join us. She's always, you know, there's some people I've met through leadership law, you know, I don't understand how much time they have in the day. They must have 48-hour days, twice what I have, because they're everywhere. Those people are leaders that others look up to. And I think it's mainly because they try to give. They're givers. They give energy. Last thing before I close, you know, my wife keeps asking me, when are you going back to Neiman Marcus? When are you going back to Neiman Marcus? And if I understood right, you guys are all at Neiman Marcus today, that beautiful training room upstairs. And the last 2 years I was there, they left some goodies for each of us. Well, I want someone in that organization to help get me some brownie points at home. Don't forget my goodie bag. If someone can get that and share it with me when I get back from Guam, I would be appreciative. Until next time, I appreciate the chance to be a part of Leadership Longview, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Neiman Marcus, for having us, and we'll see you next time.